Now I will just tell you a bit more about how we perceive different emotional expressions. So yeah, now not only expressions of like deep attraction, but also just their basic emotion displays, and also in how far they actually resonate in our bodies. Because in this sense, also we've already talked about emotional contagion, and already in the lecture that has been given this morning, the keynote lecture, and it has also been shown that perceiving emotions can also have an impact on our physiology and prepare us for actions. However, when we look at what's happening nowadays, we can actually see that, okay, I think this is still not working. I'm very sorry, but it's not going to the next slide. Here we go. Now you can see the next slide, right? I think so. Okay, cool. So yeah, now actually when we meet others, just when we meet them on the streets, or also when we have work meetings, they are mostly in a very weird new context. So usually when we meet others on the streets, our faces are half occluded by masks. Or also when we meet each other in meetings, they take place online, so we only see the face, but not the entire body. So in kind of this holistic picture of emotional expressions is gone, and we only have fragments of information available. So in that sense, it really fits my research question well, in how far actually we do perceive different emotional expressions, and how those resonate in our minds, so in how far we make interpretations about them, and how far these interpretations are also accurate, and also in our bodies, so in how far they affect our physiology. And so for that, I first looked at prototypical expressions, so facial expressions and also body postures, and which are like have more of a signal character, and they can be very nicely voluntary controlled. But also at the subtle cues that Eliška was already mentioning, that are more automatic and that we can't control it easily, such as a blush, pupil dilation, or tears. So yeah, in my experiment, I used 3 different types of stimuli. So I looked at facial expressions, which I took from the NIM-STIM set, and I looked at expressions of happiness, of sadness, of fear, of anger, and compared them to neutral expressions. I also looked at the same expression categories for body postures, which I took from a B-stimulus database. And then we also created subtle cue stimuli, which are basically neutral stimuli, but then we added just red cheeks to simulate a blush, or tears to the eyes for a tearful expression. And then for some, we also enlarged the pupils to create like a dilated pupil expression. And while participants were viewing these stimuli, we were measuring their skin temperature with a thermistor on their right cheeks. And we were measuring their facial muscle activities of the corrugator supercilii and the squamaticus major on the left side of their face. And we were also measuring the skin conductance on the non-dominant hand, and we're collecting their gaze data with an eye tracker. So in the task with 71 participants, participants first had to passively view the stimuli for 4 seconds. So they didn't have any task, but they were only observing the stimuli. And then in a second task, they were labeling those stimuli first according to the emotion category which they saw in the stimulus. And then they indicated how intense, so how emotionally intense they perceived the stimulus. So for all the results, I did multi-level modeling. And first we can look at the behavioral interpretations, at the subjective interpretations. So first we could actually see that people were really well able to recognize emotions from the different categories. So in red we can see the bodily expressions, and in blue we can see the facial expressions. And indeed they were all a lot better than chance. However, we found variations in the accuracies as well as also the intensities. And yeah, those were really different or depended on whether it was shown by the body or the face, but also for the different categories. And specifically outstanding here was the effect for happy expressions. So while happily body expressions were really, really not really bad recognized, but like only to 60% recognized facial expressions were recognized at ceiling performance. But this has also been already found in previous studies, so the happy facial expressions seem to have a really high recognition advantage. And when we look at facial muscle activity, we could only see differences between neutral expressions and emotional expressions when facial expressions were shown. And here you can see the neutral expression, so the facial muscle activity to neutral expressions in blue. And only for happy facial expressions, which is indicated in green, we could see like large differences or deviations from the neutral signal, which are in line with the literature, so that we have kind of a relaxation of the corrugator muscle, so decreased activity of the corrugator muscle, and increased activity of the zygomaticus, which indicates smiling. So when we look at skin conductance level and skin temperature, then we could also see that compared to the neutral expressions in the blue, the different emotion categories had an effect on the measures, and they were mostly altered, so the measures were mostly altered to expressions with high perceived intensities, even though there was not a clear pattern over facial and bodily expressions. And what we also did was that we tried to replicate these results in random bootstrap samples, so where we basically took random subsamples from our big sample and saw whether we would also observe the effects there. And only for the effects indicated with the error, so for this cubic-like trend in the skin conductance level for angry facial expressions, and this initial dip for sad bodily expressions in the skin temperature, only those could actually be reliably replicated, and the other effects, they couldn't be replicated. When we look at the subtle emotional cues, there we could see an outstanding peak in the skin conductance level for tearful expressions. And this was also robust when we tried to replicate the effect in the random bootstrap samples. And this is actually really interesting because it also corresponds that those expressions were really perceived as emotional intense as the only subtle emotion cues. So to sum up, what we saw in this experiment was that independent of the source, emotions could be recognized above chance level. However, there was some variation so that some expressions could be recognized better than others. But when we look at the physiological level, the patterns that we observed could not be replicated in basically the random bootstrap samples. So there was no clear or robust physiological pattern in a passive observer. And the tears as only subtle cues had a strong resonance in the observer, so only they were perceived as really strongly emotional, and they also elicited this peak in skin conductance level, which is in line with a previous research who described tears as a very effective call for social support. So it also elicits in others the wish to help the person when they see that someone is crying. So yeah, you can maybe also, you might maybe also realize this in everyday life. You don't see it that often, so it really strongly affects you. So my take-home message from this experiment was basically that even if we only have limited information available, we are able to read others' emotional states. And I think this is really also important in these times, so that even if we might not see everything from the other person, so even if we might not have the facial information or like the bodily information, we can still know what's going on in the other person. However, our bodies might not respond to these expressions or share them if we don't have a function. So if we are only passively observing the expressions and we don't know the people who are displaying this and they are really static, then they are not really a threat to us, or we also don't really want to interact with that person, which is also why we in our lab try to move on to more naturalistic settings, in which there's also really a benefit of sharing the emotions of another person, and something that Fabiola will also talk about later in her talk. So, but for now, I just want to thank my co-authors, Donna, Milica, and Mariska, for their support. and also the guys on the right who helped me a lot with like the statistical analyses, as well as our entire co-found lab, and of course NWO for funding this research. Yeah, and now I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. And yeah, if you want to get in touch, then just contact me on Twitter.
Okay, there's no questions in the chat yet.